Politics and economics. Let's take a minute to discuss the intersection between politics and economics. I highly suggest taking an economics course if you haven't already, to give you a background about what we're going to study here. This is really just going to get our feet wet in terms of the world of economics, but there's much, much more to learn. So if this seems interesting to you, this may be something you want to take a look at. Politics and economics. Politics is the power and resources deciding who gets. Resources can be broken down into a lot of things, but one of those things is money. Economics really has to do with the money which is revolving in the political system. Economics is the production and distribution of a society's material resources and its services. The political process informs and creates an economic system. It gets to choose what type of economic system that particular system or that particular government is going to employ. We're going to talk about 4 different types of economic systems. The first type of economic system that I want to talk about is called the traditional system. The basis of the economy is it's all built around the family or the community, and they make choices together. They have rituals and customs which they use to decide how things are going to go, who's going to be the next leader, how they're going to divide up crops or shares. Examples of this would be subsistence farmers and tribal societies. This is really the only place that we see it anymore, except for some of your local governmental structures, very, very small. You can think of a couple of clubs or PTAs which may operate this way. Secondly, we have a pure market economic system. In a pure market, it is individual consumers who are the basis of society. In other words, how they act and how they consume product actually is what makes the choices for that type of economic system. So if they are consuming more and more of something, then it's that way in which that economy will lean. However, if they are not, then that part of the economy will cease to exist. We actually don't have any examples of a pure market economy in the world in terms of countries. We don't have any country which operates wholly on this type of premise. When we get to mixed economies, we'll talk a little bit more about how we as this country operate. But in terms of purely operating on consumption to make choices and the individual consumers having that say in that choice by the way that they consume, there are no known countries that do that currently. A command economy has the central government as its basis of the economy. All the choices are made by the government, the basis of the economy is the government, and that's why it's called command. We can see a couple of examples of this in Cuba and China. However, China, and to a lesser extent Cuba, are definitely trying to move toward a more market-driven or mixed economy. However, when you have a government, which is all the decisions in terms of what is being sold, what is being bought, how the money and resources go around in an economic system, if all those choices are made by the government or primarily by the government, then you have what's called a command economy. Lastly, we have a mixed economy. Mixed economies, the base of the economy is the market, so that's the individual consumers and how they buy and consume, but it also has a governmental component to it. You can think of it kind of as a mixture between pure market and command. So you have the consumers who will go out and they'll buy things, but at the same time you have the government stepping in to possibly offer subsidies to somebody or to help in certain failing parts of the economy to make sure that they continue to stay afloat. So the United States is an example of a mixed economy, as is Japan, as are quite a number of different economies. It seems that as we watch the economies in this century, everybody seems to be moving closer and closer to the mixed economy. In the United States, for example, we have a system where we have a lot of individual consumption and consumers definitely have an impact on the market. However, we also have a system, for example, where we have subsidies which are given to individual farmers and for types of crops to help stabilize the farming production in this country. If that didn't happen, if we didn't have that type of government intervention, if we were on a pure market system, then it is possible that those farms, that those businesses which rely on crops in this country would not exist. They wouldn't be able to survive in the pure market. Now, these are the way that some economists break down the four economic systems. Are there hybrids? Are there other types out there that may not fit completely in the box? Absolutely. We're trying to put boxes on things which are kind of oddly shaped. And so really, we're not going to find a lot of countries that fit exactly within these models, but these are the ways that we classify them for terms of at least beginning that discussion. So let's talk about politico-economic systems. Political-economic systems really have come about because political scientists needed to talk about these things and give names to them, and because we like to make up words a lot. And so we've created a couple words that you've probably heard before. Capitalism is an example of a political economic system. It's when the market determines the production, distribution, and price decisions. And so we can think a lot about what we just talked about in terms of the four types of economies. In this instance, we have two different types of capitalism that I want you to be aware of. One is called regulated capitalism. Now that's when you have the market determining production, but we also have procedural guarantees by the government. The government actually has a say in this. They step in, they have regulations, they have ways that they work certain things, and they have rules. Whereas a laissez-faire capitalism is, we also call this the free market capitalism. This is where you actually have no regulation by the government whatsoever. It is purely the market determining the production, distribution, and price decisions without the influence or interference of a governmental structure. The next political economic system I want to tell you about is the socialist economy, or socialism. This is when the state is going to determine the production, distribution, and price decisions. So instead of the market doing it, just replace that with the state. All of the property is government owned, and the state is going to use that property in order to determine how it wants to produce, distribute, and regulate prices. There are a few nations which still claim allegiance to socialism, particularly a strict socialism. We see a lot of countries now who began with a more socialist lean, possibly in the past 2 decades, but have been moving toward more of a capitalist society since then. And then we have social democracy. Social democracy is a hybrid of capitalism and socialism. And like I said, we have quite a few countries which are moving in the direction of capitalism, but they still have a little bit of their social roots involved or values, and so we think of those as social democracies. So let's try to match up these three with what we just learned about the different types of economic systems. When you have a political economic system, it is still going to operate with an economic system involved. And so it's never going to be the case that you're going to have a political economic system that stands on its own without any type of economic system to back it up. They're always going to work in tandem together. So sometimes you hear these things mentioned and you think that they really don't go hand in hand, but we want to think of them as partners. So let's take a look at the first one. Capitalism. We have regulated capitalism and we have laissez-faire capitalism. In regulated capitalism, there are governmental procedural guarantees to the way that the market is going to flow. This sounds a lot like a mixed economy. We have a situation where we have a government stepping in to help regulate the market, but we also have individual decisions by consumers influencing the way that the market works. Laissez-faire capitalism, we said that this is the free market, which purely relies on market forces, and so we can say that that is a market economy. Socialism and communism would be state and government owned and determining everything, and so that would be a command economy, and the social democracy is a hybrid of these two, and so that would be a mixed economy. Here's an example of the countries that we talked about before. The United States having regulated capitalism, England, France, and Spain also employ capitalism. China and Cuba are communist socialist countries moving toward a more democratic nature. And the question that I want to ask and that we want to look at is, are some economic systems good and some bad? The reason that we want to look at this is because there is a very big stigma around certain types of political economic systems. Even though they were just words that we made up, we tend to, in this country, have a great fear about certain systems, so we want to talk about those a little. In that, let's give a brief history of the polarization of these political economic systems. Really, it dates back to World War II. In World War II, if you remember your history, we had the Allied forces defeating the Axis forces. After that, we had the United States, we had the Soviet Union becoming world superpowers. They were really the only things left that hadn't been decimated during the war, and so they were able to build themselves up as political and economic superpowers during the time. And because they couldn't figure out which one was more dominant, they struggled for a good long time to figure out who had that power. Now, the struggle wasn't purely economic, it also had to do with their political system. The United States employed a capitalist political system, and the communists were employed in the Soviet Republic, the Soviet Union, sorry about that. So the political economic systems which they were using at the time were different, they were polarized. And this was a problem because you had two very strong nations competing for world dominance who had very different ideas about what political economic systems and what politics and economics should look like. Cue the Cold War. Again, this is something that if you have not studied yet, I highly suggest picking up a book or taking a class on this particular era of American history. During the Cold War, we had a problem in that both the Soviet Union and the United States were worried that the other side was going to take over and impress their particular political economic systems on the world. The Soviet Union was afraid the United States would take over Eastern Europe, change everybody into capitalists, and the United States was afraid that the Soviet Union was going to come in, take over Western Europe and areas around them and turn everybody communist. And so they began an arms race. They built up these massive military arsenals, missiles and nuclear weapons and all sorts of things, which they didn't thankfully fire at each other, but they just held in reserve to show that they were a big enough power that they could use them if they wanted to, and really just to threaten the other side to stop their influence in whatever part of the world they were worried about. The United States also adopted a policy. What containment was the idea of, if there is an area which is currently communist or socialist, we want to plant capitalist areas around that area in order to keep that particular communism or socialism from spreading. On this particular map, everything that's red, pink, has the socialist communist stamp on it. Everything that's blue or light blue has more of the capitalist stamp on it. And then you can see little X's here and there for where there are rebels of the different areas. So you can see, for example, how around the Soviet Union, all of Western Europe over there was capitalist. And then we can see how around areas like Cuba, we had areas which are circled. You can kind of draw a circle around Cuba, and there are a lot of different capitalist areas there. So that's kind of an example of how containment was working. As you probably know, the USSR dissolved in 1991, and this ended the Cold War. There was really no one for the United States to compete with anymore because they had their own internal problems over the Soviet Union. However, because we had such strong propaganda during the Cold War, there are a lot of people who still fear this communist takeover. So they say bad things about communists and socialists and Marxists, as is demonstrated in this cartoon. It says, you know what those damn Marxists want to do? Take away our tree, as these three people are holding up the hammock for him. So because this isn't a class about political theory, I don't want to go too much into the differences between communism and the different types of political economic systems that could possibly exist in this area. We'll talk about a few of them later on in the class, but I do want to bring up Karl Marx's communism because it is very, very widely misunderstood, particularly by the United States. Karl Marx was a political thinker. He disagreed with capitalism. He thought, there's a problem here. In this particular system, we're exploiting the many people in order to benefit just a few people. This is a problem. Why is it that we are allowing a system to create such a horrible situation for the many people, and just a few people are going to benefit? Shouldn't it be that more people are going to benefit and be raised up? One quote from his famous book, The Communist Manifesto, is differences of brain, of intellectual capacity, do not imply any difference in the nature of the stomach and of physical needs. Socialism is only assured when distribution of all benefits and burdens follow the maxim, to each according to his need. Basically what he's saying here is, I don't care how smart you are, or how dumb you are, or how rich you are, or how poor you are, everybody gets hungry. And so everybody should be able to get according to what they need, not according to what their intellectual capacity is. This was Karl Marx's view of communism. Now, did communist countries necessarily take this as Karl Marx explained it and run with that as their political system? Not necessarily. That's not what I'm arguing. But I think it's important to go back to what the original thoughts were in order to see what the idea of communism was in the very beginning. So you can look at communism and socialism as working together, the way that I said that you always are going to have a political system and then an economic system which it chooses. Communism and socialism work together because socialism is that economic system. So that's why you're going to hear about them mixed together quite a bit, is because you're going to hear these different words, and communism and socialism, even though socialism is only an economic system, gets so heavily placed with communism that oftentimes you hear the terms interchangeably. So we'll be speaking about them later on to fully understand the differences between the two. Like I said, I highly suggest picking up a book or taking a political theory class if you're more interested in these types of systems. Keep in mind this and other ideas of economic systems as we continue our study. And like I said, this is only an overview, and so there are many other systems out there. I just want to start you opening your eyes and taking a look for the different systems which exist and being able to identify them as they come across you in your daily life.